I'd like to make this announcement at the very start while everybody is alert. And tonight's talk is going to be on climate change, apparently. I'd like to bring your attention to two books that are classics. One is called How to Talk to a Science Denier. That's one of the premier problems of our age is people don't want to think about something that they think they might have to get involved in if they haven't seen this book. It's called The Climate Book. If you only had time to get one book on climate change out of the hundreds that are out there right now, this would be the one I would recommend. So thank you very much. That's The Climate Book by Greta Thunberg.
Okay, Dave, go ahead and introduce and
Yeah. All right, our speaker tonight is Dr. Guy McPherson, who will be addressing us on Zoom. And he's going to be talking about climate change, something that we all need to know.
I'm going to talk about abrupt irreversible climate change. And because I did not know about abrupt irreversible climate change until after I left active service at the University of Arizona, I didn't reach that conclusion until June 20th, 2012. So I'd been away from campus life for a few years. These are some of the consequences of abrupt climate change that we are seeing in evidence right now. I'm going to pose 10 different questions. No need to write these down because I will take them one at a time, starting with the most simple of questions, I think, for this group. What is anthropogenic climate change? I'm going to draw all of my answers. Responses will be drawn from the peer-reviewed literature or from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which itself draws from the peer-reviewed literature. In this example, I'm using the IPCC to describe what anthropogenic climate change is. I think it's been up there long enough that people can have had a chance to read it. Now, as gases, most of us know about carbon dioxide. The most common, most abundant greenhouse gas is water vapor, which has a very, very rapid return time. Methane is also considerably more powerful than carbon dioxide. And there are 39 others that I know about besides the ones on this list. So that's anthropogenic climate change. The next question was habitat, and I'm drawing here from the peer-reviewed paper in Wildlife Society Bulletin. Habitat includes the resources and conditions present in an area that produce occupancy, including survival and reproduction. Obviously, habitat is organism specific because what one organism requires for its survival is different from what another organism requires for its survival. Moving on to civilizations, the creation and maintenance of civilizations requires abundant growth, storage, and the ability to distribute grains. And this paper is from the Journal of Political Economy. And they are referring to civilization when they write hierarchy arose as a result of the shift to dependence on appropriable cereal grains. The cereal grains in question here are rice, wheat, maize, commonly called corn in the United States, and soy. So then, what is required to grow, store, and distribute abundant grains? To do that at a large scale, that requires a cool, stable climate. And those kinds of conditions arose on Earth coming out of the last ice age some 10,000 years ago, when the planetary temperature stabilized a few thousand years ago. There's considerable controversy about whether that was 5 or 6 or 10 years ago, but we'll just say a few thousand years ago, which led to the creation of several civilizations, the likes of which had not been previously seen in the very long existence of our species on the planet. So apparently a cool and stable climate is required to grow grains and therefore sustain civilizations. I think that most of us know that the Industrial Revolution began in the mid-1700s. It started in Great Britain, at which point machine advances had been made that allowed manufactured goods to be greatly, the production of manufactured goods to be greatly increased. And there are a few examples that are given there that carried us into the mass production experience that we're all familiar with now. The El Nino Southern Oscillation is poised to bring a dramatic increase in temperature and greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. You can think of the ocean as something of a battery. The battery stores heat and it stores greenhouse gases. We're in the midst of a triple dip La Nina, which has never been observed before in the history of recording El Nino and La Nina events, which goes back some 75 years. The El Nino Southern Oscillation releases those greenhouse gases and the heat from the ocean into the atmosphere, where they are able to have profound impacts on the quality of human life. In fact, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration announced via press release on May 11th, 2023, that the triple dip El Nino was giving way to a rapidly transitioning El Nino Southern Oscillation. The El Nino Southern Oscillation blog published by NOAA announced via blog post on June 8th, 2023, so just a couple of weeks ago, that the El Nino Southern Oscillation has arrived. There's a 56% chance it will be a strong event and an 84% chance it will be at least a moderate event. This is a bit of information that should be of considerable concern to those of us. All heard about the importance of 2 degrees C, specifically above the 1750 baseline, 1750 being a relatively broad range of a mean of times. As I referred earlier to the Industrial Revolution beginning in the 1750s, the mid 1750s. Well, the precursor to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases. And in their final year of existence, they indicated that beyond 1 degree C may elicit rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage. In other words, the Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases recognized that 1C was a serious threat to ecosystems and their ability to respond. And I'm not sure how we lost track of that when an economist of all people decided that 2C was the better number. In fact, David Spratt, climate science speaker and writer, said in his presentation in October 2014 that self-reinforcing feedback loops have been triggered at 1/2 of a degree C above the 1750 baseline. Now, this is pretty important because it only takes one self-reinforcing feedback loop to be reported, to be discovered, before climate change is irreversible. Indeed, when the IPCC was created, and that process took a few years through the Reagan administration, Princeton professor Michael Oppenheimer pointed out on the Environmental Defense Fund blog that the US government saw the creation of the IPCC as a way to prevent activism. In fact, he points out that the IPCC was designed to fail with respect to significant changes that would produce positive results at the societal level. And sure enough, I would argue that the IPCC has indeed failed and continues along that wayward path. That notwithstanding, despite never taking the precautionary principle into play, the IPCC concluded in their October 8th, 2018 report, Global Warming of 1.5 degrees, that the human-driven change, reviewed literature they cite, indicates that even abrupt geophysical events do not approach current rates of human-driven change. As nearly as the IPCC can tell, and the IPCC is incredibly scientifically conservative, the planet is undergoing the most rapid rate of environmental change in planetary history. This is kind of a big deal because it's the rate of environmental change that dictates whether species, communities, ecological assemblages will continue to persist. In a follow-up report less than a year later, the IPCC concluded in their special report on the ocean and cryosphere and a changing climate that climate change was in fact irreversible, and they attributed this irreversible special report on the ocean and cryosphere indicated that an overheated ocean was responsible for the irreversibility of climate change. And obviously with a El Nino headed our way and going to release that heat from the ocean, this is a cause for particular concern. However, we are beyond 2C that I read every day. We need to be concerned about crossing the 1.5 degree Rubicon. We're beyond 2 at this point, as Andrew Glickson points out in his October 9th, 2020 book, The Event Horizon. And this is in fact most of the abstract for chapter 5 of that book. You can easily find it online. And he indicates that we are beyond 2C, which only mattered because 1.5 or 2C drives self-reinforcing feedback loops, take the situation out of human hands. That's already been done, as even the stunningly conservative IPCC reported with that special report on the ocean and cryosphere. And it gets worse, of course. On page 32 of his book, The Diversity of Life, E.O. Wilson wrote that humanity has initiated the 6th great extinction spasm, rushing to eternity a large fraction of our fellow species in a single generation. So we're already in the midst of a mass extinction event, and we have been for more than 30 years. Again, one of the things I hear almost every day is we have to make sure we don't enter a mass extinction event. This, by the way, is at least the 9th, not the 6th. Upon release of this paper in Science Advances on June 20th, a few years after E.O. Wilson pointed out that we were in the midst of a mass extinction event, the lead author, Gerardo Ceballos, said life would take many millions of years to recover, and our species itself would likely disappear early on. We would be among the first species to disappear as a result of this mass extinction event. In addition, Giovanni Strona and Corey Bradshaw, in their November 13th, 2018 paper in Scientific Reports, again, part of the prestigious Nature series, indicated that not only would our species likely go extinct, but all life on Earth would go extinct during extreme environmental change. And according to this paper, extreme environmental change would be a result of a 5 to 6 degree temperature rise over a span of centuries. Bear in mind, we're already above 2, and the rate of environmental change is critically important, far more important than any particular number we happen to reach along the way. One of the things I read almost every day is we can't afford to go above 1.5. We can't afford to go above 2, because at 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever number somebody is making up, we're likely to go extinct. Well, it has a lot more to do with the rate of environmental change than it does with any particular number. Strona and Bradshaw do point out that a rogue, seemingly desert Earth wandering across the universe would still have some tiny chance of blooming again under some lucky and unlikely circumstances. So if that's the hope you're depending upon, I think we're in real trouble. In fact, I think we're in real trouble. An ice-free Arctic Ocean will produce the fastest rate of environmental change in the history of our species. Such an event was projected to occur in 2016, plus or minus 3 years, in the renowned Annual Review of Earth and Planetary Sciences, published in 2012. How renowned? The Annual Review series publishes 1 volume per year. So everything fits into that single volume, or it doesn't get published. The ice-free Arctic Ocean was predicted to occur by Professor Jennifer McKinnon in 2002 and by Professor James Anderson in 2023, that's this year. And the best news I could possibly give in a presentation like this is that according to the 6-month ensemble forecast created by the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School, an ice-free Arctic Ocean will not occur this year. They put out 6 months in advance, and they're incredibly conservative from a scientific standpoint, which is what you might expect, given that this was the same group of professors who incorrectly projected an ice-free Arctic Ocean to occur in 2016, plus or minus 3 years. So they are being very conservative. Here's the data from Friday, yesterday. And as you can see, on September 17th of this year, we bottom out at 4.686, about 4.7 million square kilometers of ice floating on the Arctic Ocean. And you can also see that the forecast has been below the actual data shown here with the red dots, below those red dots, below the actual data for every date so far. So this is great news, and you can find this information. I would recommend that you track it this year, next year, and so on, because it will give you a good idea when an ice-free Arctic Ocean will occur, and therefore when we are likely to lose habitat for most, if not all, species on Earth. That's kind of grim. Henry G. is a paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, and senior editor at Nature, and he concluded on November 30th, 2021 in a paper in Scientific American, and this was actually in the final line: if we're going to write about human extinction, we better start writing now. And the title, as you can see, is Humans Are Doomed to Go Extinct. That's very inconvenient. I'm not a fan. Moving on then, the next question is, what is the aerosol masking effect? The aerosol masking effect results from industrial activity, as does planetary warming. So this is an interesting catch-22. Planetary warming results from greenhouse gases that trap heat. So once the radiation gets through the atmosphere, it can warm the soil and the buildings, thus the urban heat island effect, and the planet in general. And greenhouse gases trap that heat so that about 30% of it is held in the atmosphere and therefore cannot go back out into space. Obviously, this is a good thing for life on Earth. Without the greenhouse effect, we wouldn't have life on Earth. But the bad news is we are well beyond the point at which we can stop the greenhouse gas from having negative consequences. According to Professor James Hansen, which most of us know as being one of the founders of understanding climate change, the aerosols fall out of the atmosphere in about 5 days. And he has pointed this out in many presentations and in much of his writings as well. The cooling resulting from aerosol masking in total right now is 55% globally, including a lot of that being on land. This again is from the peer-reviewed Nature series. This is an open access peer-reviewed journal, so you can actually find this paper by just pointing in these relatively few bits of information. June 15th, 2021, Nature Communications. If you do that at Google Scholar, for example, you'll find this paper right away. And here's the bottom line from the abstract of that paper. By accounting for sampling biases in previous research, the magnitude of, and here they're talking about the aerosol masking effect, increases by globally 133% over land and 33% over the ocean. 133% over land. Well, that's where most of us live, isn't it? So this is, again, a cause for great concern, since most of us live on land, and this will be a very, very rapid heating event transpiring over the course of a few days. Moving on then, does anthropogenic climate change poses an existential threat? And according to paid climate scientists, corporate media outlets, and government officials, anthropogenic climate change certainly does not pose an existential threat. However, abundant evidence indicates otherwise. Either a reduction in aerosol masking, which I just described, or the uncontrolled meltdown of some of the world's nuclear power facilities will cause additional planet heating, sufficient to cause loss of habitat for human animals. Remember, we're animals too. Specifically, we're vertebrates and we're mammals, both of which are threatened, and we're losing many of those species on a very frequent basis already. What's the deal with the uncontrolled meltdown of the world's nuclear facilities and and how that would affect the temperature. Well, first, to reiterate again from aerosol masking, it accounts for 133% over land and 55% increase in overall planetary heating. And this is important because the rate of environmental change is such a profound concern. And we're currently at a little over 2 degrees C above the 1750 baseline. Well, that 55% is going to take us to about 3.1 degrees, according to James Hansen, in about 5 days, if it persists. According to a paper in Communications, Earth and Environment, again, an open access paper published April 12th, 2021, the Toba supervolcano eruption caused severe tropical stratospheric ozone depletion. That's the title, and that's the point that they're trying to make. And the meltdown of nuclear facilities would also produce the same outcome. In fact, the 2021 film Finch, which I think was a brilliant description of loss of stratospheric ozone as a result of nuclear power plants melting down. Now, in the film, power plants melted down. They never mentioned that stratospheric ozone was being stripped away. They never mentioned that that's what was happening. Also, somebody would put their hand or their arm out into the sun and it would burn within a matter of seconds. Actually, it would probably take a few minutes, not a few seconds, but I'll attribute that to artistic license. In any event, loss of stratospheric ozone accelerates planetary overheating. Even the writers of this film knew that, but I've not seen a single paid climate scientist write about it at any time. In addition, there's this thing called the things just slipped my mind. Okay, I'll move along. Here's a paper in Science Advances published on May 8th, 2020, called The Emergence of Heat and Humidity Too Severe for Human Tolerance. And Colin Raymond, the lead author of this paper, indicates previous studies projected this would have happened decades from now, but this shows it's happening now. In other words, what we expected to happen decades from now is already going on. The phrase I was trying to come up with was wet bulb temperature, and more recently in the Journal of Applied Physiology, the so-called 35 degrees C wet bulb temperature doesn't hold up. For years, we've been told that 35 degrees C at 100% relative humidity would cause organ failure. And what this paper in Journal of Applied Physiology points out is that it would take considerably less than that for even young, healthy adults to survive happily. They started to experience organ failure at wet bulb temperatures significantly lower than 35 degrees C. This again is a matter of considerable concern. When I was living in Belize in Central America, I was working beside other carpenters and we were building structures. And these are people, unlike me, who had spent their entire lives banging nails with hammers and building buildings. And this was in 2018 through 2020. And people were already experiencing organ failure. In any event, this paper found that even young, healthy adults experienced adverse consequences as a result of wet bulb temperatures significantly lower than the number that people have believed for a long time would cause organ failure. So again, that's problematic for human animals. Again, we're in the midst of a mass extinction event. We're in the midst of abrupt and irreversible climate change. Burke and colleagues indicated that climates like those of the Pliocene will prevail as early as 2030 in the current era. That's not long from now, and persist under climate stabilization scenarios. Now, the Pliocene was about 2 degrees warmer than it is right now, and that's 2 degrees Celsius. And 2030 is not far from now. Will climates like those of the Pliocene will prevail as soon as 2030, and this paper uses the representative concentration pathways of the IPCC, which ignore self-reinforcing feedback loops and also ignore the aerosol masking effect. So this is, again, a paper that only looks at a part of the story as it's unfolding. As I already indicated, the representative concentration pathways, again, relied upon here by Tresos and colleagues in Nature from about 3 years ago, that the abrupt exposure events will begin before 2030. So again, I think human animals are facing significantly difficult situation ahead. As Southwestern American writer Edward Abbey wrote, if the situation is hopeless, there's nothing to worry about. And I tend to share that concern. Hope, after all, is to cherish a desire with anticipation, or to want something to happen or be true. That's from my Merriam-Webster online dictionary. To want something to happen or be true. I want a lot of things to happen. I want almost everything I've reported so far to not be true. But that doesn't make it so. Hope is no solution. In fact, Cactus Ed recognized that and indicated that action is the antidote to despair. So what matters for us as individuals and collectively? We have our to-do list. We are aware that we are going to die, something I realized when I was 11 years old. And most people know that they are going to die by the time they're 12 years old. And then we sort of get caught up in life, and we tend to forget that we are actually going to die. We live as if we're going to live forever. And that sometimes doesn't work out that way. A couple of cartoons to indicate the kinds of things. First, on the upper left, most people do not lie in their deathbed thinking I should have bought more crap. And what almost all of us do in this set of living arrangements is use the expectations of others as the bars we use to trap ourselves into a cage. How many times have you wanted to do something that was beyond societal norms, that was beyond what all your friends are doing, because it seemed like the right thing to do, but you didn't because everybody else didn't think it was the right thing to do? With respect to what we ought to do, Kurt Vonnegut, quoting his son Mark, said, "We are here to help each other through this, whatever this is." And then quoting his uncle Alex, said, "We are here to fart around and don't let anybody tell you any different." I think we can do both of those things at the same time, almost all the time. At the community level, I would like to think that we can address racism, misogyny, homelessness, and other community level challenges that continue to persist in almost every city in this country and probably throughout the so-called first world. With respect to what we do as individuals, Nietzsche pointed out in his book, Twilight of the Idols, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how. So if you find some reason for your continued existence, and so far you must have, or you wouldn't be here today, if you can do that, then you can bear almost any how. For me personally, I'm a teacher. This is who I am. This is not merely what I do. This is who I am. 18 years after Mary, I'll call her Mary because that's her name. 18 years after she took my conservation biology class, And I required students to complete a significant piece of art or literature as a major part of their grade. And every student in every class that I had do this screamed, went to my department head, screamed some more, yelled at me, yelled at everybody who would listen, that this was not science. This was art. This was literature. This was not science. 18 years later, Mary had her significant piece of art or literature when I met with her in Florida. It was important enough that she held on to it all those years as a reminder of what matters. For me as a teacher, I used to spend a lot of my time doing public speaking. 2 or 3 weeks out of every month, I would voluntarily speak about abrupt, irreversible climate change to audiences that numbered from very few to in the 300 range. And also, along with my partner, created a workshop for people who have come to grips with the idea of human extinction in the relatively short term, and they want to think about how they're going to live in response to that situation. So we have created this workshop, and I used to travel all over the place carrying this message. Those days are behind me now. Again, as Nietzsche pointed out, he who has a why to live can bear almost any how, and this applies to you. I just described what I do in my life in response to the relatively short time we have on this most wonderful of planets. I can't tell you what to do. Even when I was teaching classes, I never told my students what to do. But I would encourage you to find a why to live, because having done so, I think your life will become much easier. And I would happily turn this over to somebody else at this point. And I'm going to try to figure out again how to unshare my screen.
Okay. All right, are you about ready to finish up there, sir?
I am finished up. I'm ready to take questions.
All right, sorry, I just had to leave the room for a minute. All right, you got, most of you guys know the procedures. For those of you who are new, I'm going to tell you briefly, we're going to take some questions and answers for our speaker, and we just had some people join us late. There will be a recording. I'll post it up tonight. We got people already online asking questions, and we also do it live here. So the first one I'm going to give to is Charlie, and then I think that's Jake. So Charlie, go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, sir. Dr. McPherson, you began by discussing the temperature of the Arctic waters, and I don't want to oversimplify things, but isn't the one significant measure of all that are out there is the temperature, I believe, would be the temperature of the oceans. Am I correct, or is that an oversimplification of measuring climate change?
Well, the temperature of the ocean is very important. Yes, I wouldn't say it's the most important thing. I would say the most important thing is the rate of environmental change. And when we lose ice floating on the Arctic Ocean, the rate of environmental change will be exceptional, to say the least. And so that's what has me particularly concerned. Yes, the ocean temperature is of huge concern, and during an El Nino Southern Oscillation event, a lot of heat is released by the ocean into the atmosphere and therefore goes onto land where we live. So that's a cause for significant concern. It's the kind of thing that is being measured, not with nearly as good of precision as it could have, or nearly as many places around the globe. But as a species, we caught on to this whole idea of climate change relatively late and didn't take it seriously until quite recently. So I guess I'm not surprised that we're not taking all the measurements, and we haven't been taking all the measurements we could have been for a long time.
Okay, Jake, I think you're next, and then Chris. Go ahead, Jake. I think you're the one on the phone there, ending in 2935.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Jake.
Okay, good. Thank you for your talk. Can you repeat your name and affiliation and contact information? That's number one. Number two, what do you mean by what do you call it? Aerosol depletion? What was the term?
Yeah, aerosol masking. So at the same time industrial activity produces those greenhouse gases we all know about, it also produces these tiny particles called aerosols. Those aerosols go up into the atmosphere and they block incoming sunlight. It's as if we're putting a bunch of beach umbrellas up or tiny mirrors. And almost nobody knows about this, even though there have been more than 24 peer-reviewed papers going back to 1929.
Wow.
It's this information that seemingly never gets out to the public because it points out that the constant demands on the populace to conserve won't necessarily lead to the outcome we expect. In fact, if we turned off industrial activity today, within 5 years, the global average temperature would rise 55%, and on land would rise 133% over the more than 2 degrees C it's at right now. So this is a very, very important matter that almost nobody understands or knows about. And again, it was hidden from view and remains hidden from view for a long time. I didn't discover it until I read a paper by James Hansen and colleagues, came out in December 2011. So I probably read it in early 2012. So that was almost 3 years after I left campus life. So my affiliation and so on, and how to contact me, again, I'm Guy McPherson. I'm Professor Emeritus at the University of Arizona. I was on campus for 20 years, and I realized that it was overpopulation. It was too many rich people driving us to extinction. And when I realized that I was among those rich people, relatively speaking, I couldn't take it anymore. So I opted out. I retired with honors. That's what emeritus means. I had to negotiate for emeritus status because I was too young to retire. But they let me go at the age of 49. And I lived off grid for more than a decade. And then, having discovered the aerosol masking effect and also the loss of stratospheric ozone when some of the world's nuclear facilities melt down, I learned about those things, and it occurred to me that I'm not doing any good by living off grid. One, I'm not setting an example that anybody is following, and two, it's making my life pretty unpleasant.
Okay.
Okay. But
wait, excuse me, just to repeat again, what is aerosol masking? What does it mean?
So at the same time industrial activity produces those greenhouse gases, it also produces these tiny particles that go up into the upper atmosphere. That's a result of industrial activity. You see it when you get behind a diesel truck and they take off after being at the stoplight, and the black smoke that comes out, those are aerosols. They go up into the atmosphere. They act as little mirrors that prevent the light coming through and striking, and therefore warming the planet. Those are the aerosols that we've been warned about since 1929, at least. And when they drop out of the atmosphere, as they will in about 5 days, according to Professor James Hansen, one of the true founders of our understanding of climate change, in 5 days, the planet will heat to a very high level in a very short period of time. So this is a cause for considerable concern. More about me, you can email me at guy.r.mcpherson, that's McPherson @ gmail.com.
Okay, Jake, we got to move on now. So, Chris, you got the next question? Go ahead. Unmute, Chris. Chris, you got to unmute.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Thanks, Charles. Dr. McPherson, I have a doctorate as well, but in a different area. But I'm also a state officer for the Sierra Club in Texas, and I could use that through the probably the chat at one point, so I could actually forward that to our engineers and scientists on our end. Like to see if we could get a presentation from you. So if that's possible at some point, Charles said somehow somebody get that into the chat so I can actually forward that. The other question I have.
Before you move on, what did you want put in the chat?
I need a contact for you.
Okay.
But yeah, that's I got your name, but I'll need some way for us to contact you so that we can get folks on board to see if we can get a presentation from you. And this will start here in Texas, Austin, Texas, state capital. So I'll wait to see if do you need a second for me to wait to see if you can get that into the chat?
I'm putting it there now.
All right.
Okay, I put in my email address and also my blog. My blog you can find at guymcpherson.com, and you can find my email address there without too much difficulty.
Great.
And
Go ahead.
And you can also find everything I've talked about in this presentation on my blog, because I try to keep up on the information as it comes out.
Perfect. Also, one of the things that has recently happened is that the Department of Energy in Washington, D.C. has moved forward to support water vapor, which is basically using hydrogen as fuel for engines throughout the entire country. Do you have any comment about what that impact will be, since water vapor is a significant greenhouse gas?
Well, hydrogen is a carrier. It's not a source of fuel. It carries energy. So, and the amount of hydrogen necessary to, for example, power your car going down the road, you would have to have a tanker the size of the huge oil tankers, the 18-wheelers, just to get you from one hydrogen filling station to the next 100 miles or so. So again, hydrogen is a carrier, it's not a source of energy. So I'd be concerned about headed that direction. In fact, there's a book from, it must be 2005, plus or minus a few years, called The Hype About Hydrogen. And I would recommend that.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. McPherson.
Sure.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Charles, I think you got a hand up with a by a person by the name of Tanner.
Yeah, Tanner, go ahead, unmute yourself, ask your question.
All right, I had to use the Tanner. Go ahead, your hand's up.
Yeah,
Sorry
can you hear
about
me
that.
now?
Yeah, Tanner, we can hear you. Sorry about the delay there. I had to.
And I frequent it, especially the last 6 months I've been following you. And I've been wondering, towards the beginning of the presentation, I said something in the comments. You said that we're already at 2 degrees. And I asked if that was because of the aerosol masking, or if it was also because of we moved the timeline back for the baseline of the of when we started, when you know what I'm saying, like back from the 1850s to this, and we moved it to 1850s and the 1750s. Is there any other reasons that we could see at that high degree forming now?
Oh, so I think you're breaking up a bit there, but I think the question is, are we at 2C because we've had some aerosols fall out of the atmosphere? Is that the question you're asking?
No, like I was wondering why you would say that we are already at 2.
I'm quoting renowned professor Andrew Weiglickson from his October 9th, 2020 book, The Event Horizon. And he quotes considerable literature in that book, which was published by Springer. So you go to page 31, which you can find online, of the Event Horizon, and you find that he is indicating that we're above 2 already. Now, you'll have to dig beyond the abstract you can find online and track down a copy in the library or something to determine the literature that he cites to reach that conclusion. But it's abundant. You know, it's not something that he just made up, and it certainly isn't something that I just made up.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I wasn't claiming that you were making it up. I was wondering, like, what are the things that he says add to that or make that up?
It's primarily because of greenhouse gas forcing from greenhouse gases since the mid 1750s, mid 1700s. Sorry.
Okay, I'd like to move on now real quick. I'd like to take the next question if you don't mind. Do you see any hope out of this mess at all for us or not? Because, you know, I'm looking around and I'm seeing myself, hey, what can be done to stop this? And do you have any thoughts on what it will take?
According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, perhaps the most scientifically conservative body in the history of the planet, we are in the midst of abrupt and irreversible climate change. I doubt there's anything that can be done about it. What we can do in our own lives is act decently. What we can do as communities is try to eliminate racism and misogyny and homelessness. What we can do as a society is try to shut down the nuclear power plants before a few of them melt down and strip away stratospheric ozone and therefore superheat the planet in a very short period of time. These are the things that we can do. I continue to support a project founded by a postdoctoral student at Harvard University, Ye Tao, and it's called the MEER Project, which you can find at MEER.org. And the MEER Project, it's a framework, and it starts with reflecting significant light back up into the atmosphere before it has an opportunity to warm the planet. I think had we started 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, the MEER framework would have been a great idea. And maybe it's not too late. I think that we have to act as if it's not too late. We have to act as if we can still fix this. And that means supporting the MEER project at MEER.org. I'll put that into the chat.
I have a question. You say, I mean, working against racism and misogyny and homelessness is very good. What about people like Extinction Rebellion or Extinction scientists? Are you connected to those people at all? Do you see any hope in there? The CEO of Chase Bank was testifying at the House, and he told in response to why not lower oil loans, he said that's what people need, that's what people want. So the people have to educate government. Government isn't going to do anything, or do very little, if anything. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely, I agree. With respect to Extinction Rebellion and the scientists affiliated with Extinction Rebellion, I support some of what they do, but not all. Encouraging young people to get thrown in jail purposely to act out so that you do get thrown in jail is perhaps the worst idea I've ever heard. Our lives are short. I don't care if you live to be 120 years old. At the end of those 120 years, you're going to think, man, that was pretty short. Most of us don't have that long, and you're going to get thrown in jail. I wouldn't encourage anybody to act illegally and therefore get thrown in jail.
Right.
Life is short. Live, but don't live like that.
Right. You know about Juliana versus United States, right? The court case?
Marginally.
Yeah. You don't see much hope in that, right?
Well, I think I think taking things through the legal system is a good idea. I'm a huge fan of justice.
Right.
But I'm not a huge fan of violent acts that will get you thrown in jail, because I think your life is already too short to spend any time in prison. I have not spent any time. Well, I've spent many, many, many days in incarceration facilities when I was teaching in them, but not from the perspective of somebody locked up. It's not a pleasant place.
Okay, we got another one live. Go ahead.
Guy, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Mike Lehman. Thank you for the presentation. You know, I'm not crazy about the word that Bernie Sanders and everybody else uses.
Can't hear you.
Speak up a little bit. Just speak up a little bit more. Go ahead.
I'm not real crazy about the word existential because it's not a solid word. It's just something that's like mysterious. And I know Bernie Sanders and a lot of other climate people use it. And I don't think it's descriptive enough of if this is a very serious situation, which it sounds like it is. I'm kind of 50-50 with climate change all along. I think it's a concern. But I think, you know, in America, like people don't even know how to spell it existential, and they don't understand what it means. And, you know, that's why a guy like Trump gets elected, because he's plain talking.
Is there a question?
What's your question?
What's your question, Mike?
Okay, can we change the word existential, one? And then my second question is, why are there not reporting stations of temperatures around the globe? Like Chicago would be a perfect location to check year-to-year temperatures. And I try to do that. It doesn't seem like we've had a lot of cold weather. So I think, okay, so can we get rid of the word existential, one, and have a little more descriptive word? And then two, can we have Chicago as a reporting station for year-to-year temperatures so we can track this? I mean, every year there's records of that. So, you know, why is that? Why do we have to check water in the Arctic or in the Antarctic? You know, it's not solid enough. In Chicago, we have every day, everybody knows the temperature. So can we track it? Chicago's a good place to have tracking of temperatures year to year, day to day, decades and decades.
Okay.
So why don't we have that? Why don't we have tracking?
We've heard it. We heard your question.
And can we get rid of the word existential?
First of all, I'm not in charge of the dictionary, so I can't even comment on existential. Secondly, there are many weather stations administered by the National Weather Service in Chicago that are measuring daily temperatures and precipitation. It's the accumulation of those numbers that climate scientists have been using for more than 100 years to track what's going on. And in the early days, of course, all those weather stations were in cities where they were susceptible to the urban heat island effect, which causes nighttime temperatures to not go down as much as they would without all that concrete and asphalt. So measurements have been taken into account to come up with more reliable numbers than the raw numbers that are reported from places like Chicago and thousands of other places around the country by the National Weather Service. And you can easily find those for Chicago and any place else online.
Okay, let's move on. Ernie, you haven't had a question yet. Ernie, unmute. You haven't had a question yet. I'll let you go next.
Yeah, okay. Hi, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Dr. McPherson. I unfortunately didn't catch all of it because some things were going on here, but my question may be irrelevant if you're right that you know, we can't, we're doomed. Maybe that's not exactly what you're trying to say, but what my question is, historically and for the future, what effect does the massive population increase that we're experiencing have in all the people who are using all of these resources in greater and greater numbers as time goes on and we have more and more offspring?
You know, Paul Ehrlich wrote at the Mob blog several years ago. Mob is MAHB, Millennium Assessment for Humanity on the Biosphere. And you can look on the Mob blog for a paper that he titled Too Many Rich People. And that's basically the bottom line. He then went on to write several paragraphs, all of which pointed to, it's not the poor people on the planet who are causing overheating, who are causing the horrors of misogyny and racism and so forth. That's the rich people. And by rich people, he's talking about people like us who have laptops and can afford to participate in this conversation. You know, it's a tough thing to reverse, given that we're all born into the set of living arrangements, born into captivity, according to my friend Timothy Scott Bennett. So how do we reverse that? It's tough, and that's why I showed that slide that indicated that other people are handing us the bars, their expectations, and we're using those bars to build a cage around ourselves. We're using the expectations of others to trap ourselves into a certain way of living. Can we do better? Of course. Will we? Well, it's been a tough battle so far, and you don't find very many people who are trying to jump off the bucking horse.
Okay, Mel, you got a question? Go ahead. Mel, you're up. Mel Kademas?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Dr. McPherson, do you hear me, guys?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Dr. McPherson, pleasure to have you, this opportunity. I have a question for you, troubling as it is. Have you done any research regarding the latest year possible for us to live on Earth in its current direction as a species, whether in a business as usual model or under some sort of reform economically and climate reform, climate change reform?
Well, I indicated the paper in precedes the National Academy of Sciences, indicating that we can expect to be entering the Pliocene as early as 2030. And that paper used the representative concentration pathways and therefore ignored self-reinforcing feedback loops and also ignored global dimming or the aerosol masking effect. So I strongly suspect it could be before then. Now, I'm personally stunned that James Anderson, the Harvard atmospheric scientist, famous for discovering the link between the emission of chlorofluorocarbons and the growth of the Antarctic ozone hole, he concluded, and here's the quote, that you can find in Forbes after a presentation in Chicago. This was published in Forbes on January 15th, 2018. And Anderson said, quote, "The chance there will be permanent ice in the Arctic after 2022 is essentially zero," end quote. So I'm stunned we made it this long.
Okay.
I strongly
Any
suspect-
indication that it might go, say, at the end of the century?
I strongly suspect that we're going to have an ice-free Arctic next year or the year after that. In the wake of that, we're going to lose habitat for our species and
Rapidly.
most, if not all, life on Earth.
Mhm.
I don't think we have until the end of the century. I think that's insane to even propose that idea as the IPCC does on a regular basis. Even 2050 seems like a joke to me and not a good joke. I'd be stunned if we made it to 2030 as a result of the literature that I've seen and the rapid rate of environmental changes already underway, and it's predicted to be much faster in the wake of an ice-free Arctic Ocean.
And therefore coercion makes no sense at the hands of, say, the Security Council, as Professor Johan Rockstrom indicated in Breaking Boundaries on Netflix with David Attenborough. Would you say?
You know, it's pretty interesting. I have a friend I haven't met yet, and she's a personal assistant for a billionaire in Switzerland. And when that billionaire, whose name I don't know, or trust me, I would let you know, when he flies anywhere, and he flies a lot in his personal jet, he uses two personal jets, one to fly in front of the one he's in. That way, if there's any turbulence, the jet he's in can go around. We wouldn't want him to get an upset stomach. People who tell you that you need to conserve are not taking into account the aerosol masking being retained by billionaires such as this. I mean, this is one billionaire who's probably using more fossil fuels in a year than everybody in this Zoom does in 10 years.
Okay, Terry B, okay, go ahead, you get your question, then we'll get to
Yeah.
Terry B.
Yes, hello, thank you. I would preface it with a statement to the effect that this is very old news. I was hearing intense news about potential climate change about 30 years ago. I would recommend everybody do a Google for Art Bell, now deceased, who used to run a talk show called Coast to Coast AM. His podcasts are still available and they're prescient. My question is, have you heard of chemtrails? And if you have, what effect do you think they might have on climate change, and could they possibly be being done by the government?
I'm a scientist, so I don't talk about chemtrails because that's nonsense, not science.
I'm sorry, I must disagree.
Okay.
In Chicago and in many cities, if you happen to look up from your cell phone, you'll notice streaks in the sky. Normally, contrails from
Yes, those
planes.
are contrails.
Yeah, contrails disperse. Chemtrails do not. They spread.
You know, when you can send me a peer-reviewed journal article that indicates with great certainty that these chemtrails actually exist, then I might be willing to take you seriously.
I'm sorry, this is 30-year-old news.
Okay, anyway, we want to move on to our next questioner. Charlie, I know you're up. Jake, I know you're up. I'll allow you guys in a minute after we get after Ellen's question. Go ahead, Ellen.
Okay, hi. I had a couple of questions. One is I'd like you to repeat, like, what are the two, like, it seemed like you were saying that IPCC and one other source, what were the main sources you were using for this presentation? Or, okay, if you could answer that question first. What sources are you using?
I'm using peer-reviewed literature And occasionally the individuals who produce the papers, for example, James Anderson at Harvard and Jennifer McKinnon at the University of California, San Diego. But
Okay.
mostly I'm using peer-reviewed papers and occasionally the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which relies completely upon peer-reviewed papers for their work. Those are my sources.
Okay,
Okay, and so if I'm understanding you correctly, you are saying that you don't think it's possible for us to reverse climate change. You don't think there's some kind of geoengineering fix, or that if we severely cut back on carbon emissions, which I admittedly don't think is likely going to happen anytime soon at all. And I'm wondering, kind of on the vein of what the questioner a couple of questions ago asked, how my understanding is what you're saying is that once these aerosols or whatever it was, cause this problem, that we only have like 5 years or so, and that the temperature is going to raise dramatically. And yeah, well, that's my understanding. If you could correct me if I'm wrong. And how long, once this happens, this event where things start climbing out, when do you think that's going to happen? And do you think we have like 5 years left, or 6 years, or 30 years? Yeah, that's a question.
okay, go ahead.
It's already happening. It hasn't happened to you. It hasn't happened to somebody you know, but it's already happening. According to the peer-reviewed literature, and I'm sorry I don't have the paper here in front of me, but if you go to an essay at guymcpherson.com titled Extinction Foretold, Extinction Ignored, you'll find a paper, a peer-reviewed paper, indicating that 5.1 million people die every year as a result of, quote, non-optimal temperatures. Those non-optimal temperatures, for the most part, are a result of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. There's 5.1 million people. The fact that you haven't felt the impact of ongoing, abrupt, irreversible climate change does not mean that other people aren't feeling it. People are dying by the many thousands. It's already underway. We are in the midst of abrupt, irreversible climate change, as reported even by the unbelievably scientifically conservative Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I don't know when. I get asked this every day. Most people, when they ask when are we going to die, they want to know when am I going to die? And I don't know. It's difficult for me to predict your death, much less the death of everybody on the planet. But we will be out of habitat in the not too distant future. And again, I'm not going to put a name on that. Thanks for including the link in the chat to Extinction Foretold, Extinction Ignored, the short video version. That was from CB. So I don't know when you're going to die, and I don't know when I'm going to die. I think it'd be really cool if all of us had it stamped on our forehead at birth, our death date, and we couldn't see it, but everybody else could. And that way, if it was like 10 minutes from now, I know to walk away from you instead of having conversation, because you might get hit by lightning. But there are things we don't know. I think we should act like decent people regardless. And that means at the individual level, at this community level, and at the societal level. And we all know people who aren't acting that way. Most of them have interrupted this Zoom already tonight.
Okay, I'd like to
Charles, this is Chris. A gentleman by the name of Ron has been holding his hand up, but I don't think he knows how to use that.
One more quick question, and that is, I heard it speculated at some point that could result in changes in the deep currents of the oceans, and that could actually cause an ice age. I was just wondering if you heard anything about that.
Yes, of course. I hear that kind of thing on a very regular basis. And yes, the AMOC, as it's called, the Atlantic Meridional Ocean Circulation, is in the midst of slowing. Will it slow in time to compensate for a rapidly overheating Earth, it would surprise me very much.
Okay, there's,
Again, I continue to support the MEER project at meer.org, even though the number of physical mirrors that would need to be placed to stabilize temperature where it is now, to stabilize it, to prevent it from going up any further, would cover the continental United States. So that's a fairly significant number of mirrors. I'm not sure there's enough sand on the planet to produce that number of mirrors. But I think that's our path forward. That's the only way that I've seen moving forward in a positive manner. That and changing our lives to a very great degree. And that's why it's called the mirror reflection framework, because the physical mirrors are just one among many strategies we have to participate in collectively.
okay, Ron, I know you've been waiting, so go ahead and ask your question. Ron? you
Yes,
there?
yes, I can hear you. One thing in the presentation that I noticed fairly early that wasn't discussed is the role of cloud cover and the effect of climate and climate change. And the biggest effects on that come from the galactic radiation and the solar radiation, and that combination. So one, part of the question is whether you're actually familiar with Lars Svensmark, I think it is, from Sweden, who's done extensive work on that. We're also dealing with, in these various gases, of nitrogen is 71% of the atmosphere and oxygen is 28. Well, then we got 1% left. And like the big presentation around carbon dioxide being the poison that it's supposed to be, that's 4% of the last 1%. So when you're dealing with these kinds of things, first of all, the question of the cloud cover and the effect of that, and the actual fact that Lars has actually replicated that in laboratories. And then the other thing is, in light of what you've been stating here and all these experts and whatever, since you've mentioned a number of people from Princeton, has there ever been a public discussion in public or a debate with, say, William Happer, who disagrees with your computer models, saying that they're based on preconceived assumptions? So do you, first of all, I know you know Happer. So those two questions: what is the role of cloud cover and the formation of clouds? And secondly, why not this public debate?
I've written about cloud cover. I think it was at my essay called Climate Change Summary, which you can find again at guymcpherson.com. And it's one of the, I think it's posted right on top of the page, called Climate Change Summary. And you scroll through there or use the search box, you'll be able to find information about cloud cover and its importance.
Okay.
Yeah, but what he says is that it totally dominates any man-created effect.
Well, he's absolutely wrong about that.
And we have that debate in public.
Okay, guys.
Please let me answer that question. I'm glad to debate any idiot such as that in public. It
Like
is never going to
Happer?
happen.
Happer?
Next.
Okay, now, Charlie and Jake, you guys already had a question. We got one more person, Julie, who hasn't asked a question. We're gonna cut off our question period after this last question. Julie, go ahead. Charlie and Jake, I'm sorry, but we're running out of time. We want to get to rebuttals. Remember, we will continue the Zoom call afterwards. So Julie, go ahead and ask your
Okay.
question.
Okay, thanks, Charles. Yeah, real quick, given the time is short here, I was just wondering, Mr. McDonough, if you are familiar with, or Mr. McPherson, I'm sorry, if you're familiar with Cuba's state policy to confront climate change. It was a plan that was initiated back in 2017. It deals with reforestation, protection of coral reef beaches, et cetera, et cetera. But so I kind of feel like the dire nature of what's going on with climate change, collaboration globally is indicated. And so I'm wondering if you're familiar at all. And I know it's difficult just because of US-Cuba relations and US sanctions that are make relations a little bit more challenging. But if you haven't any opinion about or thoughts about that, I'd appreciate it to hear.
It's unfortunate that Cuba is small and populated by relatively few people. The actions they took during the so-called special period after the Soviet Union collapsed and the actions they continue to take in light of climate change are truly revolutionary. They turned their education system upside down so that it focused only on public health and
Okay.
I used to be able to keep track of these things in my beady little brain. In any event, they focus on what really matters. And this shows the importance of having a benevolent dictator, that you can change the public education system essentially overnight. And now Cuba has among the best medical doctors in the world. If you're in the midst of a planetary emergency, the people you want to turn to are Cuban doctors. A good friend of mine had his life extended considerably by a Cuban doctor when he broke his neck working on a project in Madagascar. Station is the heat engine that's based on 5 peer-reviewed papers by Tim Garrett in Utah. And so in other words, it doesn't matter if we use solar panels or wind turbines. And to the person who asked if I was serious, if I actually believed what I was saying, of course I do. I'm a scientist. I have collated the work of other scientists to present my findings. But I didn't write the paper by Burke and colleagues in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, pointing out that we're headed for the Pliocene by 2030. I didn't write that paper. I just told you about it. That doesn't make me the bad person here. I want to finish with a brief statement that I've made perhaps hundreds, maybe thousands of times, because I'm asked every day for advice about living. In response, I recommend living where you feel most alive, and simultaneously where you feel most useful. I think this is really important because remaining useful to other human beings and to the living planet makes us feel good, makes us feel like we're doing something that is beneficial, because it is. I recommend living fully. I recommend living with intention. I recommend living urgently with death in mind. I recommend the pursuit of excellence. I recommend the pursuit of love. In light of the short time remaining in your life and my own, I recommend all of the above, louder than before, more fully than you can imagine, to the limits of this very restrictive culture and beyond. For you, for me, for us, for here, for now. Now is what we have. Live large, be you, and bolder than you've ever been. Everybody else is taken. Live as though you're dying. The day draws near. And when I say live as though you're dying, I'm referring to how people actually live when they are in hospice. They live with incredible honesty. Your dying grandmother would never lie to you, and she would catch any lie you told her. Let's live honestly. No lies of omission, no lies of commission. That's enough for me. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining in.
Go ahead, David.